listening to the Christian Ghetto Podcast. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Christian Ghetto Podcast. I am really excited to have on today Last Things. Welcome, Last Things. LA or LT? There we go.
Some people refer to me by LT. That name's kind of stuck. You're welcome to use LT.
There we go.
But yeah, it's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have this conversation. We got to know each other. You reached out to me originally to be part of your December Advent movie watching bonanza, which I really enjoyed, and I had a lot of fun with our conversation. And it's funny, since then I've watched a couple movies and I've had this thought of that would make a really good conversation with Last Things about this movie. Anyways, we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, earmark it. I'll have you on next year, man. Just make a note of what movie you'd like to discuss.
Yeah, and I'll probably have 5 or 6 now. Then I have to decide now. But anyways, we're here in part to talk, and I've done this with a couple of other folks that I know, I talked with John Slaughter about his journey sort of out of, Protestantism, sort of wandering in the wilderness for a bit, and then coming back to the Christian faith via the Catholic Church and what that meant for him. And especially in the journey of around the feminized nature of Protestantism. And he has a lot of thoughts to say about that. I also had a talk with Jeremy Carl, which is a unique story because he grew up in a community that was somewhat Protestant, but as a secular Jew, and he journeyed from secular Judaism to Protestantism, and now is a devout believer in the Reformed tradition, right? So, and so it's your story, as the title of this episode goes, from turbo live to Christian faith. So I thought, maybe it'd be good to have you on and talk about this, because I think these stories are, especially these days in the online environment, I think are important for us to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should preface too, Kruptos is being very nice, not outing me, but I reached out to Kruptos and was like, listen, I've listened to the entire back catalog of the Christian Ghetto. Like, I think you should have me on. I'm a recent convert. Kruptos was initially like, well, I'm very happy for you. I've done a lot of kind of recent conversion episodes, but I promised him mine is probably in certain aspects, at least, a bit of a unique story. So yeah, I converted to Roman Catholicism this past November, but I got there through the internet, like a lot of people do nowadays. But
almost like C.S. Lewis, but today's version.
Exactly. Yeah. Certainly. And I did, reading a lot of Lewis certainly helped, but to wind it back, in some respects, my journey, my journey onto the dissident right and my journey towards Christianity are very much intertwined, although there would have not been any journey to Christianity without initially my kind of step onto the dissident right and to frog Twitter. And, in some respects, my story is similar. I heard Oren McIntyre kind of tell his tale a little while ago. He and I were both longtime listeners of Dave the Distributist. I think Dave, same goes for the Prudentialist as well. I think Oren the Prudentialist and myself, we all sort of started our channels around the same time. I refer to us, I kind of forced them to join a club, which I refer to as the Sons of the Distributist, because I think we were all kind of partially inspired by Dave Green's channel. So Dave was sort of the initial pebble in the shoe for a lot of people that just kind of were in the habit of listening to a lot of intellectual discourse online. And back kind of prior to the Trump era, I was a big listener of a man you might be aware of, Sargon of Akkad. Was a big guy that kind of came out of Gamergate, sort of maybe one of the biggest online YouTube personas for like millennial men. At the time, he was sort of a classical liberal, kind of responding to the growing wokeification of media and video games and what have you. And he initially had a conversation with Dave. And at this time, I would be what's different. To take a step back, different between myself and Prudentialist and Oren is that they both sort of began as Christians. They're both military brats. I know they grew up all over the place, but both kind of identify as Southerners. So while they both, I think, kind of encountered similar personalities online that began to kind of shape their politics, they started as kind of conservative, right-wing Republican Christians. I am a lifelong New Englander. I am in the bluest part of the country. I'm in the bluest part of the country. Let's put it that way. You could just do like Russian dolls of where I grew up and where I live, and it just gets bluer and bluer. So I was very insulated from theological conversations, grew up as a secular liberal. Pretty much any kind of right-wing conversation or personality or Christian subject was kind of immediately red flagged to me as dumb by not worth my time or attention by my parents, by my teachers, by whomever. So very insular upbringing and education in that regards. But I encountered a conversation that the distributist had with Sargon, and I knew going into it that this guy was kind of religious. And I thought, Sargon's just going to kind of trample this guy. But he did not. And Dave had some sort of amazing moves. I sort of watched Dave, deliver his Aikido blows and kind of reverse the momentum of Sargon on a few topics. And that kind of got me interested enough that I just kind of hopped onto his back, started consuming the back catalog of his channel. Of course, Dave's icon is that of G.K. Chesterton. So I started reading a lot of Chesterton's apologetics. And Dave's just a great hub for both other channels as well as a lot of intellectual content. That's what kind of got me looking into Unqualified Reservations, the works of Yarvin. And for a couple of years there, I mean, now we're kind of fast forward to 2016. I still consider myself sort of a secular atheist, but I'm now beginning to kind of right around the time of Trump's first presidency, to my chagrin and horror, I'm starting to just identify as a right winger, or what would come to be known as kind of a dissident right winger. And I'm very much closeted from my friends and family and everybody in my milieu, because confessing that I'm a vampire or a werewolf would probably cause less ramifications.
It'd be easier to come out as gay.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd get golf claps and accolades as opposed to this. But it still took a long time before I would kind of come around to the Christianity of it. I mean, and that happens really gradually. I mean, when people ask me now, like, what made you decide to convert to Catholicism? I mean, my kind of glib answer is, well, 8 years. Like it took 8 years of reading, of conversation, of meeting different personalities. And I should say too, I've met in some ways my YouTube channel is kind of an archive of this, both my video essays, kind of grappling with my thoughts and feelings surrounding kind of faith and culture, as well as a lot of the people that I've interviewed throughout the years, which were, increasingly typically Christian, and primarily Catholic, although, Kruptos, I'd certainly count you amongst the many Protestant personalities I've gotten to speak with and gotten to know that have kind of impressed me. And yeah, so, I kind of woke up one day and realized, wow, most of my kind of intellectual life now is spent amongst Christians, reading Christians. And I still probably spent a year or two in this, what I'll call kind of purgatory of being interested in Christianity, but still feeling like it did not have a foothold in the real world, in my real life. I'm sure a lot of people feel this way. You kind of live your intellectual life entirely online, whereas not a lot of it leaks out in your day-to-day world. And sort of in my, in meat space, I still wasn't interacting with Christians. I still wasn't able to have these kind of conversations with people I knew in the flesh. So I wound up kind of reaching out to my local parish, and very providentially, my local parish happens to be home of the traditional Latin Mass. The priest there is a very, very based, very smart, interesting person. So I began kind of meeting with him pretty regularly and having a lot of conversations, and then returning and having more conversations with the Catholic friends I'd met on Twitter, and still kind of feeling like, I just need to have this. I was still waiting for an epiphany or some sort of cosmic sign. I felt like I needed to have some sort of very kind of dramatic conversion story.
Jesus needs to meet you on the road to Damascus.
Right. but I mean, to say, I mean, truly I didn't. It was just, a series of conversations with people just saying like, dude, you just got to do it. And so I think at some point I said to myself, I think so. You just kind of got it. It is kind of a matter of praxis. And so I took that final step back in November of, received, I was baptized, received first communion, the whole bat. So I've been in the church now less than since November. So this is only
3 months.
Month 3. Yeah.
And
I'm very glad to have done it. I people ask me, and I think they ask me with kind of a knowing smile, like, do you feel completely different? Do you feel transformed? A lot of the people in my church ask me that, and I sort of say, well, not especially, although I am very glad to be here. But that's kind of the really truncated conversion story. But what does, and again, I think that there's a lot of people now, you've probably talked to a lot of them, Kryptos, who come to Christianity through the internet, which is a very kind of novel and strange introduction. and it sets up certain challenges, especially, particularly based on where you happen to live in the world when it comes to kind of actualizing that in your, in your real life.
The funny thing is I don't meet as many people as you might think who have converted, where their conversion has began online. That's one of the things that fascinated with the story is that because yours did begin. I mean, I'm part of a small ethnic community that where part of the identity of that ethnic community is their Reformed Protestant beliefs. And so we have churches, we have our own Christian schools, and the community, even though we're all like quote unquote white people, we have like, like Dutch ethnic ties, right? So it creates here in the New World a kind of insular sort of community that way. So most of the people that I know, like 70% of my real world friends, come out of that community, and many of the even the stories of conversion. I mean, people do come from faith into our tradition, but many of the conversion stories, they follow sort of a similar pattern. I was young, I did dumb things, and then God got a hold of me in my 20s, and I realized this faith that my parents have tried to pass on to me was much more valuable than I thought it was originally. and I just basically gave myself over to it. Right. Gave myself, and that's similar to my story and many, you know what I mean? So that's often how we got, and nowadays as somebody who's close to 60, I look at young men, especially who are going through that phase. And I will tell my wife, cause she teaches in the Christian school, and she will, complain sometimes about this young guy or whatever. He doesn't care about his studies. He just goofs off and blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, you know what? I've met the boy. Honestly, I think he'll be fine. In 10 years, he'll be an elder in the church. He'll be married with 3 kids. He'll be okay. It's just, you just kind of, the story and how it goes. Right. And that's a lot of our experience in many ways. Sometimes they get married and go to other churches outside of our tradition, but that's kind of oftentimes your typical story. And then when people come into the faith, a lot of it is, again, through, I met so-and-so and he just seemed like the kind of Christian that people had told me about, but I'd never really met. And that just sort of opened the door. So that's often kind of how it goes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was just honestly, if I was going to do this Kryptos, I was really just, I would have to accept the reality that I was going to be generation 0. My mother was a very, very, very lapsed Catholic. My father was a lapsed Protestant. So both kind of I was raised entirely secularly. Their families, and even to hear them talk about it, it doesn't seem like it was something that was, woven into their life in a particularly meaningful way. I think it was fairly easy for them to apostatize, like a lot of boomers. So, I was equidistant between Catholicism and Protestantism. And I thought about, I think that, having ties of kind of blood and family and heritage, or if there's kind of a richer history of a particular faith tradition, for where you grew up, that's stuff that should be taken into consideration. I don't think it's all simply a matter of kind of, intellectual tradition. But again, living in the, Mordor of New England, there's very little, there were no roots, to discover, really when it came to faith. So yeah, I did not have that kind of stuff to call upon. It is kind of interesting. I had, there's different versions of this story that I can tell. And, one is this completely kind of cerebral version that I've already related to you, where I just kind of talked myself into it by reading books and talking with internet intellectuals. But I've talked with Jay Burden about this before on his channel. But there's a second sort of perspective, which is what I would call a more embodied rationality. I should mention, I'm in my early 40s. I'm married. I've got 2 little kids. So, I've converted in my 40s. I'm not like one of these Gen Z guys that becomes the track path prior to marriage. Although maybe I caught that same bug, I suppose. But another story is just sort of observing what entering midlife looked like for kind of liberal, Northeastern secular people. A very kind of small minority of my friends, despite our age as kind of elder millennials, have gotten married or started families. A fewer circle within that circle have, more than one child. The only child is sort of the standard family size amongst my kind of my milieu, and then a smaller circle within that circle kind of remain married. I remember around the time my wife got pregnant with our second child is around the time a lot of people that I knew were kind of getting divorced, and their reasons for getting divorced kind of boiled down to these really just like, life is harder now that we're married and we have a kid, and we're not a dual income metrosexual couple doing whatever we want with our with our surplus income. And I just did not like the idea of, if these are the families that I'm going to be raising my family next to, there's just kind of this, I don't know, this lack of commitment, or this kind of unspoken ethos that anybody could get divorced at any time. You look at larger families with a degree of kind of skepticism. There just did not seem to be this kind of this thickness, or this steadiness, or hardiness amongst anybody that I knew. And not to pat myself on the back, I'm new at being the traditionalist myself, and I'm far from perfect, but I was surprised. I was surprised and disappointed to see how a lot of people kind of began to step into midlife, and this was around the time, this was all happening synonymous to when I'm, discovering Dave's channel, or like I'm picking up C.S. Lewis and Chesterton, but I'm also just making these observations in my lived environment. My wife and I have purchased our first house. I kind of expected to be this, oh no, I've been this, successful young liberal man, and now I'm going to be this successful middle-aged married liberal in the happy functioning liberal community. But lo and behold, they're really kind of, I bought my house, I moved into a liberal community, and I said to myself, this is anything but functional. These like half of these families are divorced. There doesn't really seem to be any sense of community, or if there is, it's the classical kind of liberal platitudes of like, we're defined by our diversity or our differences. And so, yeah, I just found none of it to be all that appealing or admirable, or anything that I was kind of able to invest in. So yeah, that's just kind of a more instinctual kind of response that I was having, that was entirely separate from what I was encountering online. And I probably should give that more credit than I do a lot of the online things, is just sort of this aesthetic revulsion to liberalism that began to set in once I was married and had started a family.
I get it. I think, it's, to me, I would have to say it all kind of works together. God has an amazing way of, there is no coincidences, right, of directing all of these things. But this is one of the things that I've been, I think there's a great way to phrase it. I think there's a great opportunity right now. This is one thing that Athenian Stranger is always reminding everybody, is that, one of the defining features of our era is nihilism. And one of the things that the propaganda does, the narrative does, is it's supposed to integrate us into society and overcome the nihilism. But then, and this is part of the problem, is that the social dysfunction and the level of nihilism are reaching a point where you start to notice that the propaganda isn't holding everything together anymore. And so then you cast your eyes over to these wackadoos who go to church, and you realize, okay, maybe everything isn't necessarily perfect with all of these guys, but my goodness, that looks a whole lot more ordered and happy and fulfilled than what the propaganda is telling me my liberal life is. And I think there's something really to that. And I think this is a sense of the real opportunity with the church today, if we can get our act together, is not to, in the sort of the seeker environment or the wholesale woke churches, is to adapt ourselves to the culture to make people feel welcome, but to say that no, there is a significant, maybe even radical difference here, and within the confines, the walls, the boundaries between us and you here within this community is maybe not the fullness of what you're looking for, because we're not going to get it in a world of sin and evil. But a significant portion of what you're looking for, you will be able to find here, and it'll be good enough to sustain you and wait for when Christ returns in that regard, if that makes sense. And I think that this is sort of one of the opportunities. There's a number of reasons, and I've wrote a piece on this, of why I believe that the Christian faith, and that was kind of, I threw the gauntlet down like a couple of years ago, and I think in July, about a year and a half ago, and said, this is why I believe the future of the online right, or of the dissident right, is Christian. And a lot of people poo-pooed it, but a lot of people also embrace it. And, partly because I believe that the state and the propaganda system that sustains it takes on the role of an omnipresent being in our lives, takes on the role of God to replace the religious. And so fundamentally, the battle with the state, the battle with the regime, is ultimately a religious battle. And in the West, it doesn't mean, that doesn't mean that you're going to embrace Judaism or, Islam or Hinduism. If the battle is in the West, the battle is over Christianity. And that's really kind of where, it's going to be Christians or nobody. Either the whole thing collapses into nihilism, which probably will happen anyways. But the places where the embers burn and the fire is bright is still within Christian communities. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. So that's kind of, in regard to just sort of that observation, like it makes complete sense to me that, that would be what you would see and observe. The other thing, I guess the question, maybe this is too personal, just because of the recent, J.D. Vance thing, and how he made a conversion to Catholicism, but his wife stayed Hindu, which is just kind of odd. Was your wife a part of this journey with you? Did she come along with you, or is she still on the journey yet herself?
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's totally fine. My wife has a very different background because she was raised Methodist, and she sort of kind of fell out of that when she went to college. But her my in-laws are still very devout Methodists, very, very wonderful people. And so she sort of has more of a kind of familiarity with the church and Christianity. I mean, granted, a Catholic church and a church of the Latin Mass is very different from a kind of Methodism that she grew up with. But no, she's been very supportive of it. When I first kind of told her that this is what I wanted to do, I think that, it's fun. You and I were talking about how, sometimes both of our wives get skittish about our online digital activities. I think where things become problematic for her is not so much my involvement with the church or me involving our children in the church, but, like she gets very nervous, for example, when I'm stepping out to mass on Sunday and I'm very well dressed, and we might, I might run into some of our lib neighbors walking a dog, and they ask me why, if I'm going to a funeral, or like, she certainly doesn't want me to be in anyone's face about it, or, get into a conversation about, oh, well, were you a cradle Catholic? I didn't know. So she has concerns about what this, the signal that this gives off, given our town and our neighborhood, and the kind of politics of the other parents at our daughter's preschool.
Coming out as Catholic.
Yeah. I think what's downstream of it is, well, he probably voted for Trump, and he, probably, hates trans people. And so, there's, she's concerned about the social liability of it at times, but I don't think she's concerned about the faith itself, if that makes sense. But it's funny too, because everything you just said was great, Kruptos. I've too have been kind of selective, like if some of my closest friends, I've told this to, but I don't go around wearing a sign or anything like that. But when people do find out, or when I do inform people that have known me a long time, they all kind of say they all have very kind of liberal, platitudinous kind of responses. And one of them is like, hey man, like everybody deserves a community where they feel comfortable and at home. And they always look very shocked and kind of taken aback by my response, because I wouldn't say I feel particularly at home. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful to have converted. I think that everybody that I've met in my church community is 100 has been great and supportive, and I'm very grateful to be there. But I'm a complete fish out of water. Like I'm very self-conscious most of the time, that I probably have like the stench of modernity just wafting off of me, especially when I'm at a potluck with a bunch of cradle Catholics. I swear like worse than Athenian, and I'm just always super conscious about my language, and I'm still very kind of clumsy. And there is, I think that my kind of subjectivity as a convert will always be, at some baseline, fundamentally different from people that are raised Catholic. It's not a matter of I think it's just a very liberal perspective. It's like, oh, you should be in that community because that's the one that gets you and you just feel comfortable with. I'm not there because it's more comfortable. I'm there because I consider them to be morally righteous and more. I'm not there. This
is where God wants me to be.
Yeah, it's not like I jive with them, and they have the same favorite Smashing Pumpkins album that I do, like I do with my lib friends that I made as a teenager. It's that I feel like they have the right kind of moral orientation in the world, and I need to be there regardless of how smoothly I can enter into that space.
That is completely normal. In our community, it adds you would add another layer, is that you're not related for 4 generations to everybody in the church. You don't have the same last name. You don't have your last name sounds like you're Ferner. So there is this sense almost where, and it's probably not a terrible thing, that you will remain kind of the new guy in there. You know what I mean? Now your kids that grow up, they'll probably grow up and make relationships with other kids there. And maybe your grandkids will feel, if you're all still in the same congregation, will feel very much at home and part of the community. And that's not a terrible thing. And I think I've changed my mind in this over the years. And I think that these barriers to entry are a good thing, because it maintains a strong identity. Like, it should be you who is adapting. So there was a prof of mine at seminary, and he talked about this notion of biblical storytelling. And one of the things he said, that the part of the conversion process is a process of narrative suicide. So you come into the church, God has led you there, and now you're here. You don't maybe even understand fully why you're there. Your story is kind of messy and complicated, but here you are. You've made a commitment to Christ. You've been baptized. You've taken communion, and you're now, quote unquote, a part of the church. But there's a whole discipleship process and a whole thing that has to happen. And this relates very closely, actually, to the whole process of immigration, believe it or not. But you go into the church, and the idea is that the whole notion of repentance is to say, my life up to this point has been wrong. So then, well, what does that mean then? Well, all of the stories that I have been carrying with me that explain the world, give it meaning, that support the architecture of what I used to believe, I need to let those go. In a sense, this is that whole thing of dying and rising in Christ. So you put to death the old stories, and then you have to be taught a new story. So now you're part of the people of God. You're a child of Christ. You're a son of God, baptized and an adopted son into the community of believers. And now there's a whole set of stories that then these new stories are now supposed to be the stories that define your life and tell you who you are. So now you used to have the story, but now Abraham in some ways becomes your ancestor. He's your forefather. So the promises that were made to Abraham are now a promise made to you that has been fulfilled in your conversion. And so there's all of these types of, and so this process of narrative suicide, and really the process of discipleship is how you then get integrated in the community. And this, for me, one of the big lacunae in the Christian church is as Christendom took hold, we got very lazy with the whole notion that society would just inform everybody about what it means to be a Christian. And in many ways it did. But now that you live in a secular society, you have to be way more intentional about it. And you have to be way more intentional about teaching people. And I think especially for men, this goes doubly so. And that, men need a sense of structure. They need other men to guide them into this, right? So I guess that was the other question I was going to ask you. Was there an aspect of this, why Catholicism and not Protestantism, right? Because it might have been easy with your wife being a Methodist, and one of your parents being Protestant, that, it might have been just as easy to drift into Protestantism in that way. But what was it specifically, say, that attracted you to Catholicism?
I think a couple of things. Again, I guess there's sort of an embodied rationality, which was, those are not where I am. The Catholic churches are the ones that are not draped in trans flags with female pastors. I take no joy in saying it, but a lot of the Protestant denominations in my region are just very, very benighted, very infiltrated by wokeness. And I think there is a sort of just kind of like regional luck. Like, again, I described, I happened to live, and the odds were not in this favor, but I live close to a Latin mass. I got a good vibe from the families and the men that I met in the community. And it does, and, again, a lot of the arguments that I get to go back to kind of the through line to kind of intellectual frog Twitter and Catholicism is, a lot of the thinkers that Yarvin pulls from, a lot of the people that contribute to kind of a reactionary political theory that is feeding a lot of the, meteor critiques of our current world order. These are things that kind of are nested within Catholicism, or at least evolved within Catholicism. And I mean, obviously there are great exceptions. Like you're fantastic on Jacques Ellul, and he's a Calvinist like yourself. And I mean, really, Kryptos, if you and I had lived a mile apart and I'd happened to meet you in this journey, that there could have been a different direction to this. But just both within my physical environment and in my digital environment, 80% of the pie in terms of the personalities and the argumentations that I met kind of pointed towards Catholicism.
It's almost, dare we say, like an unchosen bond. Like it's about as close as you can come to growing up Catholic without actually growing up Catholic in that regard. So, like, this is the church that happened to be sitting on the street corner. I wandered in and it fit. It's just like
yeah. But I should probably just be sounding a lot more like loyal at this point. But I can be listening to you on one of your streams, for example, and hearing you sort of preach or kind of discuss things that I assume sort of have the inflection of your Calvinism, and I can sort of start tapping my feet to it and saying, I bet Kryptos' church is pretty cool. Like, it'd be fun to be hearing his ministry. I shouldn't be that easily swayed, but
no, and I'm a bit of an odd duck too, though. So because I happen to have a professor who's was big on Eastern Orthodoxy and introduced us to that. And so I'm Reformed, but I grew up actually in a home missions church. So one that, tried to do a lot of, one of these, big well, in the old days it wasn't big, but so very much, a seeker oriented church that tried to keep sort of like the strict Calvinism on the down low sort of thing. Right. So, my pastor is sound and everything, but it's not, I'm there because my parents are there. That's kind of, that's kind of how these things go.
And I think that's the hereditariness is important and significant.
It is,
again.
Yeah. And that's kind of, that's sort of just the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, I can get the sense of, and I think like for me, people often say, well, you don't sound very reformed. And I thought you were Orthodox. And I thought, well, part of it is because, I ventured out from my roots and foundations to explore things that I felt were missing in the Dutch Reformed tradition. And one of those things that missed, because people have often talked about sort of the head heart split, that we're too intellectual, it's too much in the head. And so people went the route of emotion, but emotion leads you basically it leads you towards liberalism, more or less, right? I just do what feels right to me.
It leads to universalism.
Yeah. And so for me, where it ended up pulling me, the answer to the question of being too theological, too heady, too institutional, and too much reliance, shall we say, on community as opposed to faith, is ultimately, for me anyways, it came down to seeing in the Orthodox a mystical tradition that we lacked. And it's interesting that the Orthodox consider Calvinists to be heretical, which is, I find that, from funny. But so for me, I often embrace this kind of mystical side, out of my Reformed Protestant. And people say, well, why don't you just become Orthodox? And I said, well, because I'm not Orthodox. This is what I am. This is, unchosen bonds. I couldn't be anything other than what I am. And so I'm Dutch Reformed, and that's just kind of the way it is. And then whatever you journey from that, that's sort of the anchor point. So whatever, okay, maybe I'm not as strict as some in sort of, voicing everything by the theology books, but I know where my heart is, and I know rootedly that I have certain patterns of thinking and, that are distinctly Reformed and can't be anything otherwise. And so it's just sort of, it is what it is. But I think that unchosen bond anchor is significant and important in a sense. God puts you in a place and he anchors you there. Now that doesn't, there is that whole question of, what happens if your church gets beyond saving in sense, can you just cut bait and move on? So That is a live question. It's not one that you make easily. But that is a reality in today's world, unfortunately. But I think far more so is a friend put it to me that churches don't survive for 100 or 200 years only through evangelism. They do so because they pass the faith on intergenerationally. And so there is that core of identity that gets passed on from generation to generation to generation, that then hopefully is folding in new people through the presentation of the gospel and through conversion. And then, those that convert in some ways, it takes them a generation or two to become really part of the community. But the wonderful thing is they come into the community, they don't know any of the rules. And so they often end up upending things that you take for granted because they just don't know any better. And it sometimes makes you think about, like, why do I do that? And maybe I should, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world to try something new occasionally, so, and just because you have somebody who's very earnest and devout, but just doesn't know, they don't have 200 years of tradition standing behind them.
Yeah. It's a challenge. I remember listening to the stream you did on the Christian Ghetto with Orrin McIntyre, Kruptos. I think you titled it something like, why online communities aren't real communities.
Real. Yeah.
And I was tempted to pitch you an episode. I'm not truly this black-pilled. That was something like, why real life communities aren't online communities, because I do think it is challenging. There are not many occasions where I I have the opportunity to connect with my Catholic church outside of Mass, simply because people are so, spread out nowadays, or like, like a lot of people in the church are, blue collar, whereas I'm like, I'm a member of the laptop class. I'm working remotely from my home, and the church has potlucks. We've got like a men's group. We're working on, my friend Ancient Philosophy turned me onto this great group called Trail Life, which is sort of like fathers and sons, Cub Scouts tied to a church. But there are, I get the sense that a church community more similar to yours is probably something that was established when, earlier in the 20th century, when, half the congregation worked at the same sawmill, or, there was more kind of socioeconomic monopolies within a community. Whereas you have, and especially when you were dealing with traditional Catholics that are coming to the Latin Mass, a lot of those families, like, they drive an hour to get there.
Yeah, I know. So and that really gets hard to do community then.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that we're in early days of people attempting to kind of rebuild or re-authenticate church communities, but there are just certain kind of like, physical challenges when it comes to creating a kind of community thickness that was maybe more readily accessible in the last century. So that's a challenge.
Well, I think too, this is something that Walter Ong noted in his book Orality and Literacy. And so there's a couple of things in terms of propaganda and technology that you have to grapple with, right? So Ong observes that Plato noted the changes that writing were bringing to a largely oral society. But you know how he communicated those critiques and criticisms and observations? He did it with writing. So there is this problem, and we've talked about, like I talked about this with in terms of political communities, that you can say to yourself, oh, well, assembly lines are horrible and evil, and a lot of this technology is terrible. I read Tolkien, and Isengard was awful, and look at what he did with the orcs. We're never going to do that, right? So, and you might be right in it might have been correct to say that, writing is damaging the community and making people lose faith in the gods and everything. Like, Plato may have been totally right, but the problem is that people knew how to write. And the thing is, you might believe this for your nation or your state or whatever, but the neighbor down the road in his state, he loves assembly lines and tanks. And unless you have an answer to his tanks, he's going to overrun you and dominate you and conquer you, and you're going to lose your sovereignty and ability to direct yourself as a people. And this notion of the tank problem runs itself all across, multiple layers. So that at the same time, we are talking and critiquing, like even now, my conversation with Oren, we're talking and critiquing the problems of online, quote unquote, community. But how are we doing it? We're not doing it offline. We're doing it online. So just like we're basically reenacting the same story that Plato did, is that we're noting the problems with the online media culture and its effect on real world communities, but we're using the highest form of communication to make that critique. So in other words, we have to recognize that we're not going to get it. Now, in some sense, why is this kind of communication really important to guys like us? Well, I don't know what your experience is, but, and you hate to kind of toot your drum, but I'm a high IQ guy. I read a lot. I'm smart. In almost every room I'm in, I'm the smartest guy in the room, right? It's, you just very seldomly do you meet intellectual peers. And when you do, they're not always interested in the same things that you're interested in. So occasionally you bump into people who are really smart and, they like, oh my word, it's so nice to talk to you. I never get to have these kind of conversations, right? So you would have one of these conversations a year, maybe every other year. right? But you just sort of settle back into life and you content yourself with the fact that, yeah, for the most part, these conversations aren't going to come. I just keep reading books. And then you get online. And like many things, you can now aggregate all of these 135 plus IQ guys, the top 1% intellectually, into a shared space. And all of a sudden, every day, all day, I can talk to high IQ people nonstop. It's brutal, right?
It's strange.
It's like crack cocaine. It's just terrible, right? So
well, I've compared it. I hate to make the analogy, but I think there's something to it, Kruptos. There's something slightly pornographic about online friendships. It's kind of a pornographication of friendship, because you kind of curate this like addictive, heightened, curated experience. But it never gets to move beyond the aesthetic. You can't, the friendships cannot be embodied the way that they can with a neighbor who, who maybe just hasn't listened to the last Oren McIntyre stream. It makes the sound turn down. It turns down the volume in your day-to-day life. And, the paradoxical phrase is modern life is so lonely and atomizing. Thank God I have my dozens of group chats on Twitter to help me get through the loneliness.
Well, but this is the thing though. And Oren and I talked about it too, is that, I just wrote a piece on how we need propaganda, right? Well, what are we doing right here is we are being propagandists, right? So in a sense, my regular, I'm deracinated, I'm empty. I don't have real community, although, I do, so that's a nice thing. But for many of us, but at the same time, I don't have a community of high IQ intellectuals that I can talk theology and philosophy with all day long. And that's all we do, right? So I come online, I get all of this, I get my hit and I get what we're really doing is these relationships are in many ways propagandistic. So the difference between propaganda and real world, on a real world relationship is always sort of horizontal. It's with people on the ground. It's real. Whereas a propagandistic relationship is in a sense always vertical. It's always mediated through the medium, right? And so in this case, the medium is, we're using basically a podcast platform. So even you and I are having a conversation that has now mediated vertically through this technological media. This wouldn't be possible otherwise, right? So this relationship, even the conversation that we're having right now, has the character of a propagandistic relation where we're engaging in social media, and social media is about again filling that emptiness of our modern life. So the fact that we're doing it is in a sense propagandistic, and so this is part of, and this is one of the things, and this is maybe to segue into one of the things that we were talking about before we came on air, is this sense of, propaganda and propagandist technique is soul destroying. It's terrible. And I'm going to get into this in future pieces, but Elul notes all of these changes of how horrible propaganda, but you can't get away from it. Because you either use it, and many of the large media, like the large mass churches, big mega churches, they're all propagandistic. They use the techniques of mass society to build, large churches at scale, right? So real communities like Dunbar's number, 150 adults, maybe 300 people, men and women, 150 men, 150 women put together with their kids in a community. Probably altogether that would give you maybe 500 adults and children altogether, right? And that's basically about as large as beyond that, you can't have community anymore. It's not real community.
Right.
And so any mass church, if you've got a church of 1,000 people or 3,000, 2,000 people, you're using propaganda to create it. Now, Elul says that it's hard to have an authentic faith relationship with God through the medium of propaganda. And I think he's right. It generally tends to be manipulative and controlling, and you can't have an authentic faith relationship in an environment that's manipulative and controlling. But at the same time, if you don't engage in propaganda, all of your people who are part of your congregation are left basically at the mercy of secular propagandists, right? So this is, again, the tank problem of propaganda. So now you have to have, in a sense, an assembly line in your church, because you have no choice but to deal with these tanks. So in some sense now, this is, I think, what we're beginning to figure out. And this is what I wrote in my thread yesterday, is that what's happening. Okay. So it used to be that in the older communities, you had sort of a hierarchy. You had the Lord, you had the lesser lords, and so forth. And there was this kind of idea of noblesse oblige. The Lord took care of the people in the communities, whatever. They were also the tastemakers. They also are the ones that dictated the morality of the community. They were at the top of the community, and they dictated everything that happened beneath them. And that's kind of, if you wanted to ascend in power, you basically imitated those who are your betters. That's kind of how it worked.
Right.
But what happened with the managerial revolution is that, your betters can be very lumpy. So some can be great betters, some can less. So the way to solve that problem is to solve it with system and policy. And you create kind of a leveling effect with policy. So now you don't need those elite lords. We can get rid of those people and we can replace it with the system. But the problem is that you still need that kind of tastemaker function. You need that to be able to set the tone for community. So even though you have no leaders, you just have managers, and the system basically dictates sort of what you still need that. And so propaganda takes over that function. So now, instead of having both of those functions in one person, the political leadership with that sort of taste-making, culture-determining role that the leadership class determine, now you have two roles. You have the managers on the one side who exercise political power, but you have propaganda on the other hand that then creates that sort of taste-making, dictating what people believe and how to believe it and so forth thing. Now, when those two groups are together, that's great. But what we're seeing is that the narrative is disengaging from the managerial class. They no longer have control of it anymore. Now, they still dominate it, but because of social media and some of these other platforms, we're able to enter into and build anti-tank weapons, so to speak. And so in some sense, this is what we're doing. And you can see, in a sense, like I look at your conversion as a success story of planting a seed through these medium. And next thing you know, you're part of a worshiping community in the real world, grappling with a sense of how do I deal with my faith in an online, all these types of questions. And so what we're doing now is we may not have political power, but we can definitely, through these social media, assert narrative power, the ability to shape a story in new. And I think this is really the power of, in some ways, the online Christian right. In many ways, because as we noted off the air, there's these two. You have sort of the secular kind of the Greeks, the bodybuilders, the vitalists. Even many of the disgruntled leftists, the IDW types, are all in sort of one camp, and then you have the Christian rightists all in another camp. And so Christian rightists are beginning to flex themselves on this media. And it's still early, but in many ways, I think we're kind of displacing that earlier, the Yarvinish, Ren and BAP type of that segment. It's never really going to go away. But in a sense, we're flexing now. We're discovering that, hey, we can assert narrative dominance, or we can assert a narrative challenge to the regime. We don't have to accept. We can just basically do propaganda on our own terms. Now, we're still, as a whole, not very good at it, but you can see definite real effects. Like and this is part of some of like the internal drama on the right is about, who's going to ascend to becoming a propagandist, right? We're still sort of trying to shake out among ourselves who's going to control this. That's always the way power works, right? But at the same time, there is now an opportunity for us to do Christian propaganda, if there is such a thing, and make it a direct challenge. We can do more than just build churches with it. We can also challenge the regime with it and undermine, because if we undermine narrative control, it undermines their ruling, the ruling narrative, the ruling formula that dictates why they have legitimate power. And so the more that you can undermine that ruling formula, that ruling narrative, the more that you delegitimize their political control of the institutions. That was a long rant, but so I just maybe throw it back to that.
I hear what you're saying. I think, I mean, one thing that is unique, and sometimes it's hard. Some people view it as an advantage. Some people view it as a disadvantage. And again, I don't mean to set these camps against one another. I have friends that are like,
yeah, and I do too as well.
Like I've got nothing but admiration for Ren and Bronze Age pervert, and plenty of my, Nietzsche bros. We're all on the same team here. But one thing that I think kind of the Christian right, I think it's harder for somebody who simply identifies with the kind of the BAP sphere to step offline, because there's no sort of analog to a parish or a church community where you can put down,
really good point.
You can put down your iPhone, and every Sunday you're surrounded by, a dozen other Nietzsche bros and their children and their wives. And some people would say, okay, granted, but the online Christian is going to, this is the like, they're gonna put down their phone, they're gonna find their local Catholic church, and they're gonna be like, why is nobody dressed like a Space Marine, and why is that nun playing an acoustic guitar? Where are the dreadnoughts?
I showed up in armor and nobody else came with armor on. What's up with that?
Where are the hospitalers? Like, what's going on? And so people might develop a certain kind of outdated and fantastical vision of what a Christian church or a Christian community is going to look like online, because they just followed a bunch of people with Templar thumbnails. Then they come down to the reality of some Novus Ordo, church that just has a few retired boomers in it. But even if a church is musty and, it's covered in dust and it feels like the community is dying, the infrastructure is still there. People could begin to come offline. And I think where they're going to look at people like you for direction, Kryptos, is to say how can I find a based church? I want to start going to church, but I how do I start to get a sense for what church is going to, be my unchosen bond, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the Christian right does have, if we can kind of breathe some of the online vitality that is occurring online within Christianity right now, and kind of light that fire and then breathe that fire into local actual church communities, I think that would be a real kind of cultural shift, and a moment where this online energy steps offline and into the real world. And I hate to say it, but I have to say I find that I think that a Baptist has a much greater challenge ahead of them if they're trying to kind of form their pirate war band with people.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, you and I both know that there are many challenges to, again, the isolated guy who comes online, finds an online quote unquote community, but then really does want to instantiate it in the real world. And there is that problem of finding a good church in their area. And that's, I'm not going to deny that problem isn't real. But like you say, one of the things that made Twitter such a powerful tool for the left is that you had all of these prestige networks that were real and active. And what Twitter did was turbo them, right? Put them onto high speed, so that now they could network instantaneously and build consensus mimetically in an almost instantaneous fashion. Well, we're able to do that, and we were able to do it online, but it was never able to be in real life. But now it's starting to be, because now what you're having is networks of church guys who are like, oh, you're super on. Now there is the whole normie Christian thing, because the guys online are a lot edgier. Now there's, guys are going back to church who've coming from the online right, aren't willing to accept many of the things that, previous generations were willing to accept for, this is how a church should be. So that might be a good thing. But I think a lot of guys who are going looking for church, you have to remember that most of your pastors are educated. Most of your church leaders are also educated. So they have professional degrees. And until very recently, they believed the narrative of a neutral society. And that if we just support a neutral society, nobody's going to mind the fact that we're Christian and we'll be allowed to function and also gain all the rewards from moving in elite circles and working in professional circles. And we'll take and so what they did is, in many ways, they found a way to make peace with their natural class, in a sense. Somebody who comes through with a Master of Divinity or a Doctor of Divinity, they see their peers as lawyers and doctors and accountants and engineers.
And they have no idea who Bronze Age pervert is.
Well, that's right. And so the people that they're looking to style, so when they go out and they get out into beyond their own church environment, the people that they naturally gravitate to are people in the professional classes. And so they begin to adjust subtly so they don't seem like your wife's like you're going to church and you're all dressed up for church and you're in a liberal neighborhood. Now you stand out. Well, nobody wants to stand out. I get that. And so, but for 2 generations, 3 generations, whatever, Christians have been, relative to the current leadership class, have been trying to not stand out, and practice. And now people are coming from the online right and saying, yeah, that's not going to work for us. We need you to stand up to them. And they're going no. Like, let's be winsome. And we have to moderate, we have to be open to people and meet them where they're at. And all these things, like, no. They can like convert or die, and so it's, and so there's a changing, and that's one of the things that we're doing here. But as you say, though, this speed run that's happening online is happening in many ways because a lot of these guys are dialed into real world networks in the Southern Baptist Convention, in evangelical, Presbyterian, evangelical, Dutch Reformed, Catholic. They're all sort of now impacting their own networks of influencers within their various churches.
I hope that happens quickly enough, because I do think one liability is if people feel like they have, some young men might feel like they have some pretty good Christian role models or mentors online, and then, try and step into a local church and suddenly, like, they don't, like maybe somebody's, subscribes to Kruptos' Substack. They really admire the guy. They feel like they're getting good kind of paternal wisdom from your material, and then they kind of try to step into their Calvinist church, and it's just normies, like I'm sure that happened to a lot of young men.
Well, and the other thing too, though, is, and I mean, like, not to disparage my colleagues, but not every pastor is a theologian or a philosopher. Some guys they're just nice guys that God has laid the burden of caring for a flock, and so they're not particularly political. They're more or less decently solid, but they're not going to fire it. And I mean, I don't generally do politics from the pulpit. Like, I'm pretty careful because, again, that, being on the pulpit is a responsibility, right? So you have to, and you're speaking to a very wide audience. So you have to bring them to a position where you teach them in smaller increments sometimes than you can do online. But at the same time, so that I think there has to be a certain measure of graciousness, that you're not going to get sort of like the hardcore online expectations in your real church. Because so there is going to be a little bit of domestication and co-opting that happens. But I do think, much in the same way that the online right has been able to move the agenda with the current American administration, that we will have a real and noticeable effect, I believe, in the churches. Now, it's been happening.
Now that's a worthy Substack, Kruptos. Write a piece about how we can take how we influenced this election and how
that might be a way to do it.
How anon shit posters can now turn our las cannons onto the church. And have
they're doing it now. And that's the interesting thing, is that you see a lot of people that have been able to say things online and control discourse are finding themselves meeting a lot more opposition than they used to, and people getting called out on a lot more things. I mean, immigration being one, right? That's sort of a primary issue for a lot of people that way, is that, so in these networks, a lot of people are, they're calling out on immigration, they're calling out on a lot of things, and the leadership is finding it very uncomfortable, and they're back on their heels a little bit. So I think there's room, and it's but yeah, so that's kind of how I see it, and I think the idea of generating a I mean, I know there are attempts to have journals and online presence, but it would be interesting to have something akin to I Am 1776 or Man's World for the Christian sphere. I know publications like First Things and American Reformer do exist, but again, there's a limit to how radical that these can be, right? So, and not to say that being radical is the end all to be all. But there is a certain sense of, as we were talking, where there's a collection of ideas that right now are just not being heard because they just fall too much outside of the lines of normal church discourse. Not to say that they're heretical or wrong or anything. It's just, they just really fall outside the boundaries of what people are capable of listening to right now.
Yeah. Like First Things publishes one piece by Lomez on the Longhouse. And I know a lot of these periodicals have policies where, we're not going to publish you if you're not going to use your real name. I think there needs to be a Christian journal that's like, you want to use your real name? What's with you? Something that's internet first, that's the kind of the home turf for the Christian periodical that we're describing. But no, I agree, Kryptos. I think the air is the ether is pulsating with the need for something of that nature. Kryptos, I don't know how much time you have left, and I don't want to change the subject too dramatically. I was hoping to get a bit of advice from you.
Sure.
As a parent, because as you know, I've only been at this 3 months, and I have yet to really kind of go about in any really official manner in kind of bringing my children into the church. They see daddy getting dressed up, and they know that daddy goes to talk to God on Sunday. And I, hearing you describe some of your wife's stories earlier about just the inevitability of the sort of prodigal son, or the apostatizing teenager, I'm so self-conscious of, I do not want to raise what I refer to as, I don't even know if I've coined this or if I kind of picked it up along the way, like a get in the car Christian. I think that my sense is that's what my parents were, and most of the people that I know within my kind of secular environment who, completely stopped going to church the moment they left home were these, quote, get in the car Christians, which is, there was no kind of theological conversation. There was no integral nature to the faith. It was just on Sunday they began to complain because they just wanted to watch cartoons, and their parents said, get in the car, you got to go to church. Yeah. Have you found, is it just sort of, you need to, especially with young boys, but have you found ways in which strategies that are more likely to meet with success when it comes to integrating a child within a church community, as opposed to I don't want to wind up being this authoritarian father that's just you're going to do this because I said so, but nor am I in a position as of yet to really be able to field any and every theological question that they're going to lob at me. Already, sometimes they kind of catch me off guard, and I wind up having to do kind of a song and dance routine while I answer certain metaphysical questions. But yeah, just within your own family or within your church, do you observe, can can you look at, okay, well, that family's children are still in the church, and that family's children have left, and are there common features when you look at those two categories?
The yeah, well, it's intergenerated. It's like I said earlier, I go to church where my parents do, right? So both my parents and my in-laws are in the same church. So it's one of the things where, like, my kids, their grandparents are a great model of the faith to them, right? So they've, that's kind of grown up. We just kind of make it an expectation. Like, it's not even a matter where we even explain or argue. We just go to church on Sunday morning. Yeah. So there is some of the, like, the crunch of getting ready and everybody being cranky with each other because we're all trying to rush out the door to get to church. And it's amazing how many arguments start on the way to church because everybody's rushed and, it's one of those things, right? It's part of the two-fro. But we have kept at it. Now because, we were a family that got into competitive swimming, and that happened at dinner time. So we have not always been the most faithful dinner devotion type family. But one of the things that my wife and I do is we do, between the two of us, a daily devotion every day. So about a decade ago or more, our pastor challenged the congregation to read through Proverbs a chapter a day. And so my wife said, we should do that. And then we should have a prayer time. Because we've been kind of talking about having a prayer time together. So now we have, since then, we read through, did the Proverbs chapter a day. And then we thought, well, that's kind of good. We've enjoyed that. And then we had a prayer time together. And the whole thing takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but we do it as a couple. Sometimes we do it in our bedroom. Sometimes we do it at in the living room. Sometimes we do it at the kitchen table. It just happens to be sort of where we are in the evening. And we're not afraid to sort of, for us to read the Bible in front of the kids. We will generally do our prayer time when it's just the two of us, right? Because that's, sometimes we're praying for friends and some of it's private and that type of thing, right? And so we will do that. And my wife and I actually get on our knees when we pray. So we do that either at the edge of the couch or, at the side of the bed, just like a little kid would do, fold their hands and the whole bit, right? And then we spend a few minutes in prayer together every evening. And we do this every evening, whether it's been a long evening, whether we're getting to bed at 1 a.m, we will stop and spend 10 minutes to read a chapter in the Bible. And funny thing is, if you keep doing this for enough times, is that you can read a lot of scripture together as a couple. Like right now we're going through Isaiah, which is like wild. I haven't read Isaiah since being in seminary. And it's just like, oh my word, there's some crazy stuff in Isaiah. It's pretty cool. And so that's what we do. And then for my kids, we get them involved in some of like the boys programs, the girls programs at church, and then also young people's. And so sometimes, like, we will, if they have homework, we'll say like, okay, you can stay home tonight from young people's, but if you're just going to be online gaming with your friends, like, you got to go to young people's, right? And then sometimes the kids will push back and say, well, like, my best friend's not going, she's going to be away with the parents, and just I don't want to be there if she's not going to be there. And it's like so sometimes you don't have to be hard to think, but my kids, in terms of, being raised with the moral frame, not just like in addition to the faith frame of grace and salvation in Christ and sin and all of these types of things, my kids got very red pilled when they all of a sudden as teens went out and got their first jobs and had to work with people who weren't Christians. Because again, they go to a Christian school. So they have church, they have school. And I mean, it's not everybody can afford a Christian school. I get that. Many kids, like, they homeschool and stuff too, but so we're blessed enough we can afford a Christian school. So the kids go to Christian school. And so they're in an environment where they're insulated in some sense, but when they got out to go to the workforce, all of a sudden that was a huge red pill. It was like, oh, everything mom and dad, like, that's why you taught us all of this stuff and why you sent us to Christian school, because I get it now.
That's great.
So that's kind of like, I know I'm by far, I am not a perfect parent, but that's sort of, so we just basically try to make it as natural as possible. And we make the expectation of coming to church as just, and now since your kids are already somewhat grown, right? So it would be a new thing for them. But my kids have been, basically they were in the babysit when they were babies, right? So they've been going to church their whole life. So Sunday morning, it's just been part of their routine, like forever. Yeah. And so that does help a little bit, but I know, there's parents in our church where kids don't want to go. They complain about it. Right. So, but it's just, kind of just do it. But I don't, it's not like I've never really got a whole lot of complaints from my kids that way about it. They've always been very good, dragging themselves out to come, even when they don't feel like it and they're tired. But I think for the most part, my kids do enjoy it. Like recently, like my 20-year-old, away at university, and we asked him, what do you want for Christmas? And he said, well, I'd like a cross pendant and a Bible. And like, do you have a Bible? Yeah, but I want a nice one that I can take with me to he was going to a youth group, like a 20-something group at the church that he was at on his own. Like, the boy goes to church twice on Sundays on his own. Because he Mom, do you know they have 2 services there every Sunday? So I started going to the second service, and we were like, oh my word. Thank you, Lord. Right. But so those are the kind of things. And, the kids all know. So it's just kind of reassuring that, so there's no real magic formula to it. And there's no guarantee. Like some kids, I have one of my older kids doesn't go to church. Just, they're out on their own. There's only so much you can do. So you pray for them. Right. They were given all of the habits and so forth. So it is what it is. Right. And then I had one that left, and he got married to a Catholic girl, and now they're, dutiful at the Catholic Church, which is kind of bizarre. So, but yeah, so it is interesting. So like life is, it is what it is. Right. So, but yeah, so I think there's no real magic, and most parents will tell you that, and you can look at some families and you think, oh, it just looks so easy for them. Their kids are wonderful and they just grow up full of the faith or whatever too. And that's great. You know what I mean? But other parents, they do all the same things, and it's just a struggle for them with their kids. So, but I just try to say to people, try to live at home, the faith genuinely, and remember that your kids will pick up on what you do more than what you say. So if you say, Christ is the central thing in my life, but work is actually the central thing in your life, your kids will see that. And so you have to really ask, what are my hard priorities? If Christ is really central in my life, then I have to live like Christ is central in my life. That doesn't mean it's the only thing I do, but it has to mean that I make it priorities. Like, I'm not afraid to talk about it. I'm not afraid to orient my life around it. I'm not afraid to make choices that put God first and not necessarily my wallet or all of these other things. You know what I mean? My relationships, my professional standing, and all these other things ahead of my relationship with Christ. And then maybe perhaps the final bit of advice is never, ever, ever, ever complain about the church in front of your kids. Like, don't complain about people at church. Don't complain about the church, because it's easy to get into the habit of complaining about that Sunday sermon or the song choice on Sunday or this and that person in the babysitter, like whatever. It's easy to get into the habit of gossiping and complaining in front of your kids about people in the church, but don't do that, because that's what they'll hear. So if you do have complaints, either keep them to yourself or just between you as a married couple or away from your kids. But give them an image of the kids, because deep down that the church is something that you want to be there. You want to be a part of it. But, is the impression you want to leave that all you ever do is complain about going to church? Because if all you ever do is complain about going to church, why would they want to go if that's all they ever hear is complaints from you?
Got it. No, that's all right? Sound advice, Fructose.
I think as a couple, like I don't know where your wife is at in terms of faith life, but that would be one of the things I would just say, just quietly finishing up, say, hey guys, we're going to do something new. At the dinner table, we're just going to read a Bible story every day. And if the kids are at that age where like the regular Bible is maybe a little bit above them, start with a good children's Bible. There are some good ones out there still. You just get the stories into them, because the stories are important. Again, we talked about that narrative suicide, right? And then, but I think as couples, probably the best thing you can do as a couple in terms of faith journey is just spend 10 or 15 minutes a day, read a chapter out of the Bible, and then spend a few minutes together in prayer. And if you start doing that as a couple, it is really a good thing.
Amen. I'll
yeah, there we go. Now I feel like you're interviewing me, but that's fine. I'm good. I don't mind having the tables turned on me. It's good. So I think it's an important thing, right? So, yeah, in terms of marriage and kid raising and that kind of thing. So
awesome. No, I will put all of that into practice. And yeah, no, sorry, but I didn't want to let this opportunity to go to waste without getting a bit of wisdom out of you, Kryptos. But
well, I appreciate it. Well, thank you. No, that's good. These interviews are fun, anyways. Like I said to, or I've said to people before, with the interview, like I don't want to get into a show where I just have to grind and like get guests and just talk to people just for the sake of having content. I record podcasts, so they come intermittently because either a person that I really want to talk to, or generally it's a conversation that I really want to have, and this is like, is the right person to have it with. Same. Absolutely. Right? So that's kind of how I run my show. And so sometimes it'll be 2 weeks without an episode. And then sometimes I'll record 3 in a week.
Cool. Well, I will have to have you on my show next time.
Yeah, that would be fun. And we can continue the conversation there. That would be good. Because I think that we're not going to have trouble finding things to talk about. So.
Excellent.
Oh, anyways, I should let them, now that we're thinking like, professional podcasting here, where can people find you if they're looking for your content?
Well, so my mainstay is just my YouTube channel. And if you go on YouTube and you search Last Things, I'm pretty much one of the top results. What Kryptos was referring to earlier was the Last Picture Shows Film Festival, this is the 2024 was the second year I ran it. It's 40 dissident influencers, creators, Twitter and YouTube personalities. I ask everybody to just pick a movie that they want to talk to me about for an hour. And then we have a chat about it. And those are, I sell tickets for that on Gumroad. So if you go onto, I think if you just type in lastthings.gumroad.com, that should take you up. And you can see tickets available. Kryptos contributed a film review this year. And other than that, I have interviews and video essays. My mainstay is I'm a film nerd. So I like to take a movie and kind of use it as a springboard to discuss certain kind of philosophical concepts or great thinkers or things of that nature. But there's just also a ton of interviews with a lot of people from our sphere of the internet.
Very good. Well, again, thank you for being on, and thank you for putting a bug in my ear and saying, hey, I would like to talk to you. And then once you suggested what we were supposed to talk about, I thought, that's a really good conversation. Let's have you on and chat about it. I'm really glad we did. So
likewise.
And it was till the next time, Last Things. And for all the rest of you, we'll talk to you again when, thank you for joining, and we'll talk to you next time. Seeking the Hidden Thing is delighted to have Axios Fitness Coaching as a sponsorship partner. JD is one of our guys and wants to make you fit for what's coming ahead. He offers a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning. Axios offers standalone training programs as well as individual coaching options should your needs require something more specific. Click on either the image below or the link in the description. Both I and JD thank you for your support.